We have a little less of a burnout day today in terms of fewer talks.
Mike, are we going north or south today?
We're going slightly north, not too far.
Brought my boots, so just wanted to ask.
Yeah. There's no snow there.
It may not have even, according to Dan Shepard, in all the rains that have happened all across the region, he said he's had nothing.
Looks like he may have missed
So
it again.
if we bring him rain, maybe he'll give us free pecans. Who knows?
Wow.
I can't say. Maybe not. Anyway, we're going to start out with a little bit of a flip schedule. Yesterday was focused on the biophysical. Today, mostly social, economic, outreach, etc. But we're going to carry over one more this morning. First presentation with Shabu Joes and Dusty Walter on the ecosystem services values of agroforestry. So.
All right. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for switching me to today. I don't know how it would have taken me 3 times yesterday. Well, I'm no rich trait, but he can go on for like a day like that, right? Yeah. 5 days. All right. So, well, I'll be talking about agroforestry's role for providing ecosystem services this morning. There are a lot of slides that I may just skip over because there is one more individual this morning within that hour slot, that is Dusty Walter, who will be talking about the wildlife benefits of agroforestry. So we may take a bit longer than an hour, but we'll try to make it not too long. Well, you heard my definition yesterday. I like this definition very much. You probably wouldn't see a definition like this in the textbook, but it is short, sweet, people understand, so I use it quite often. It's an intentional integration of trees and crops and or livestock where interactions are intensively managed. And we talked about the interactions yesterday. But one thing that that definition doesn't convey is the ecosystem services agroforestry provides. In some extensive, elaborate definitions, you will see the production functions of agroforestry and also the conservation or ecosystem services provided by agroforestry. But this simple definition doesn't do that. Well, I wanted to emphasize this particular aspect here, the ecological sustainability, because when we talk about, and I talked about ecological interactions yesterday, positive as well as negative, but mostly focusing on the negative interactions. So the positive or the synergistic interactions and the resultant services, that's the focus of the next 40 minutes of my talk, or maybe 30 minutes. We used to talk about these ecosystem services even 30, 40 years ago, ever since we started with agroforestry as a land use practice formally. But agroforestry, as you know, has been practiced all around the world for centuries. And we have records from multiple parts of the world and systems that are still in existence, that are still sustainable. And Dusty showed an example of a system like that yesterday, the Degradation systems from Europe. I just quoted a couple of individuals here. One is P.K. Nair. Some of you may recognize that name. If you have looked into the agroforestry literature, you cannot miss that particular name. He's a professor at the University of Florida. And the other one is Secretary Vilsack. Dr. Nair, at the last UFRO Forestry Congress in Seoul, South Korea, made this statement that agroforestry can be developed for, see, we have a long list of things that agroforestry can do. People use this all the time, and I use it. poverty alleviation, food security, carbon sequestration, combating deforestation and desertification, fodder and fuel wood supply, and environmental protection. For a long time, we had claims but no data. But luckily now we do have the data. And you've been seeing some of the data since yesterday. Well, some of you have been following the literature and you've seen that kind of data even for long, maybe at least in the last decade. And this is what Secretary Vilsack said: we support agroforestry as a land management approach because it helps landowners achieve certain natural resource goals, such as clean water and productive soils. Two great ecosystem services that agroforestry provides. America's economic success is directly linked to a continuous and abundant supply of clean water. Just wanted to throw it in there just to show, and again, I'm preaching to the choir. You don't need to see a statement from Secretary Vilsack to recognize the importance of water quality or soil quality, but still I wanted to show that, well, at least recognized individuals like Secretary Vilsack is talking about the ecosystem services of agroforestry. And I made a statement yesterday in response to a question that when you promote agroforestry as a land use practice, it's not always about productivity of that system. It's also about the conservation value, the ecosystem services that system can provide. And if you look at the services provided by agroforestry, it ranges from that local farm scale all the way to global scale. Let's say on a farm, that particular agroforestry, let's say silvopasture or alley cropping, is fixing carbon. Well, that footprint is not just for that local region alone. It has got global implications. Let's say an agroforestry system is protecting biodiversity. Again, it's not just at the local farm scale. It could be at the regional or global scale. So we need to think broadly when it comes to some of these services. There are four major categories of services, like carbon sequestration, one of the big ones. Biodiversity conservation, well, we recognize the importance of it, but we don't have a lot of studies in the temperate agroforestry literature proving the benefits of agroforestry in terms of biodiversity conservation. Soil enrichment, we have plenty of data right now to demonstrate that agroforestry is beneficial compared to a conventional row cropping system. And air and water quality, the data is building up, and you saw some of it yesterday, and you will see again. I first thought I would take out all the slides related to water quality, but then I thought I would just keep them there. We will just mention about and move on. So I'll begin with carbon sequestration, something that we haven't really spent much time on. So if you look at the carbon footprint of us as a country, the US produces about 25% of global CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels. No surprise to any of you. So if you look at the actual number and the different parts of the world, we are the highest with 1,600 million metric tons of carbon per year. And that is 25% of the global emissions. Can agroforestry help? Well, the IPCC thinks so. Some of you may have seen this graph already. If you look at on the y-axis, these are some of the common managed systems, production systems. And here is the potential carbon sequestration by 2040. So look at this longest bar here. And look at the land use system here. It's agroforestry. Agroforestry has the potential to sequester the most amount of carbon by 2040 compared to any of these other managed ecosystems. Like if you are restoring a wetland, that's the first thing that you see here, a managed wetland ecosystem. Look at this forest management. Again, this is on a global scale. Grazing, rice, paddy, cropland management. And here is agroforestry. Why is agroforestry so big here? Why does agroforestry have the greatest potential to sequester carbon. One of the main, say it again? Well, these are all managed systems. These are all managed systems, including, here, forest management, grazing, rice, cropland, even restoration of degraded lands. These are all managed systems. Yes.
Because of the variety that are within the system, the variety of species, not just trees, but other plant species that we have available?
That is one of the reasons. And again, management also is part of, these are all parts of the puzzle, but still that's not the main reason. Even when you have multiple species, it has greater potential than a monocropping system. That's true. Right.
Could part of it be that we're comparing agroforestry to some baseline such as straight row crop, and when you add the addition of permanent vegetation, that additive amount is what it's compared to?
Well, it is similar to what you just said because you have multiple species then, right? That's the same idea that you are talking about.
But it's not, you can go corn, beans, wheat, and you don't change much, but if you go corn, you're adding, what are you comparing to the baseline? You got a permanent vegetation.
Well,
Additive, but I'm just guessing.
well, if it is just corn, let's say, here it is, cropland management globally, and here is forest management. Obviously, forestry has got a higher potential than crops, but agroforestry is way over here.
What about the amount of biomass that all that photosynthesis is going to sequester a lot of carbon just because there's more biomass and more plants that are doing it?
Well, I don't know if that is necessarily true in all agroforestry systems, but in some agroforestry, what you said is true. There is greater potential, greater overall biomass as a result of mixing different species. Well, there is a simple explanation. I know you are all thinking, really deep, but the simplest explanation is that here, I actually had put that in here. There is a lot more land. But agroforestry could be applied.
Which is a little bit what he said, I think.
Well, no, I was thinking something entirely different. So.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a lot more land. And you may wonder, where is that land in the US? Yesterday, Andy shared his vision that 5%. How much land do we have in the US? Well, let me show you, before I answer that question, or before I let you answer that question, let's look at here, a global statistics. 17% of the world's arable land is in agroforestry. It's one of the statistics released by ECRAF and some of these other authors that I have mentioned here, and also FAO. And if you look at it, it's kind of true because you do have trees on farmscapes in most countries, even in this country. But we don't call it agroforestry. So this is kind of deceiving, but again, we don't have any data, even on a global scale or a countrywide scale, from anywhere to really quantify how much land is in agroforestry. But then, how did they estimate that much potential for carbon sequestration because we have so much land available? Well, it's all estimates. So that's all we can use at the moment. Just, I wouldn't even call it estimates. They are more like guesstimates. But let's see, in the US, here is a graph, or here is a picture. What you're looking at here is the average carbon density in live forestry pool as of 2009 in the US. What do you see? Well, darker the color means denser the potential to fix carbon, or denser the carbon. So what do you see here? Wherever we have forests, we have a lot of carbon. Well, there are a lot of white space all over the US, even when we have forests. What does that tell you? Of course, definitely we have potential to put more trees in some parts of the country. What do you do here, where we already have a lot of trees? Can we do anything through agroforestry to increase the carbon density even in areas like this? For example, the Appalachia? Is it possible? Yes, it is. How? Well, we heard from some of the speakers yesterday, forest farming. There is still potential to increase carbon density even more, even in a forested habitat. So there is potential for agroforestry pretty much everywhere. except if it is an open body of water. There is potential to put trees or other crops under trees. So some form of agroforestry to increase the carbon density overall. So I showed this picture or this graph yesterday, why agroforestry has a greater potential. I think you got the message, greater root length density, a lot of carbon below ground. And when you combine some of these species together, like if it is just a corn soybean rotation, that's all the biomass you are talking about. Imagine adding a poplar component into the system, or something, combining switchgrass poplar. You can clearly see any of these combinations compared to the corn soybean, you will have more above ground biomass and more below ground biomass. And that's more carbon above ground and more carbon below ground. And that carbon in an agroforestry system will stay longer compared to an annual cropping system. Compared to a forested system, like a forest, well, it may not be as long as a forest, but compared to a corn soybean rotation, definitely it's going to be longer. As the trees age, of course, they accrue more biomass and more carbon, both above ground as well as below ground. So if you look at, again, the US and land use practice, the yellow shows cropland. This, whatever that color is, like a hunter green or whatever you call it, it's grassland, and this green is forest, and here is the specially used urban other land. So you can see we do have a lot of cropland, pasture land, wherever you go in the US, and of course forest land also. So the bottom line is, with so much land, there is potential to introduce trees. And if you look at this, agroforestry can help increase carbon density on 23.7 million marginal pasture. That's about 10% of the pasture. And this is about 10% of the cropland. 17.9 million marginal cropland. So about 10% of the the cropland and 10% of the pasture land is classified as marginal, where agroforestry could fit in. So there is a lot of potential for agroforestry in the US for carbon sequestration. So we did some real compiling of some data to examine the carbon sequestration potential of different agroforestry systems like silvopasture, alley cropping, riparian buffer, and windbreak. We couldn't find enough data from forest farming, so that is not included here. And then used some guesstimates on acres available. That's what everybody is doing. So we also try to do the same so that we can quantify how much carbon can be fixed using agroforestry in the US. We need to start somewhere. We need to have, well, we can keep on talking, but we need to quantify it somehow. And this was the first attempt to do an analysis for the whole country. So let me share some of that data with you, and we have already published this, as you can see here, and if you are interested, I can share that article with you later. So if you look at silvopasture, and this is one of Dusty's slides, and Dusty, in your talk also, I noticed that it came up like this.
It resizes and gets kind of blurry.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why it does that.
Well, this is one of the silvopasture trials from southwest Missouri, where we have, I don't know how tall the pines are now, but this is maybe the first year after they were established. Well, if you look at 10% of the pasture land, that is 23.7 million hectare. But that's not the only thing when it comes to silvopasture. Like Dusty talked about yesterday, you can do this, converting a pasture into silvopasture by planting trees. But you can also go from a forest to a silvopasture. How much land is available for that? Look at this number here. We have 54 million hectares of grazed forest land. That is 18% of the US forest land. That is classified as grazed forest land. But is that silvopasture? Well, it's not. Some of it could be, but most of it may not be. Again, the 4 I's, keep that in mind. You have to manage the interactions intensively, and in most cases that's not happening. They just go, eat whatever they can, come back. So, but here again is the potential to really make a silvopasture system out of this land base.
Well, what would be some of the things to consider about how carbon would be sequestered if you were converting a grazed forest land into silvopasture?
Well, first and foremost, we have to look into the long-term sustainability of that forested ecosystem. And we talked about that quite a bit yesterday. How can we ensure that, well, you are not just sending the cattle and they just clear, or goats, and they just clear the understory. In some instances, that may be desirable just to clear, perhaps like Mark Kennedy was talking about, all the invasive species. But there should be a point where you think that, okay, now it's clear, then how do I make sure that the forest regenerates? So at some point you have to take care of the regeneration of that forest. But if you continue to have grazing, then it's going to be pretty expensive. And there were questions about that yesterday, and there were answers given. You have to cage them. And if you cage them, that's going to be an expensive proposition. And if you are talking about forest land, well, there are lots of foresters sitting here, and I am also trained as a forester, and I can tell you that that's not going to happen. If it is your 1 acre woodland, with some expensive black walnut that you are trying to protect, you might do that. But otherwise, probably that's not going to be an option. But can we close that forest then down for whatever number of years that it takes for the regeneration to take place and then release the cattle? That's an option. But otherwise, if you want to have a continuous silvopastoral management, you have to really protect the seedlings. Because if the forest is not healthy, then there goes the carbon sequestration potential of that forest.
Well, then erosion potential.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. All kinds of other problems. Yeah. The long-term productivity of the soil itself could be in danger if it is not done properly. That's why, the interactions. That's why I didn't go into all the possible interactions, but these are all like whatever damage that can happen to the soil, the vegetation. We need to take all of that into account. Okay. Well, I didn't give you the numbers. The actual numbers. How much carbon? Look at this, 6.1 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. That is the potential carbon sequestration for a silvopasture system based on all the published numbers. But that rate multiplied by the acres that I have listed here, it's an enormous number. 474 teragrams of carbon per year that we can fix using silvopasture. But again, how accurate is this number? That we don't know. So later on you will see that in some final analysis, I will show a bar graph where we included this number, and in one we actually excluded this number. Okay? So keep that in mind. This looks great, but it is because of 54 million hectares of grazed forest land. But again, it's just the potential that we are estimating. So potentially that land is available. Alley cropping, a practice that has been talked about for a long time, and some of the earlier examples of agroforestry in the US were alley cropping, particularly based on black walnut alley cropping. But we still don't have a lot of practitioners adopting alley cropping. So the potential is still there. And if you look at 10% of the cropland, that is 17.9 million hectares, and here is the carbon sequestration potential for alley cropping. It is much smaller. The rate here, the megagrams of carbon per hectare per year, is about half of what you saw for silvopasture, because silvopasture has got larger trees and a lot of grasses and a lot more potential compared to an alley cropping system. Well, if you multiply this with the land, about 61 teragrams of carbon per year can be sequestered using alley cropping. Windbreaks. It's really difficult to estimate what is the potential for windbreaks, but if you assume that, okay, 5% of the cropland in windbreaks, that's like 8.95 million hectares, assuming a 20-year rotation, and we used 2 species for this estimate, that is poplar and white spruce, we came up with this small figure here, about 9 teragrams of carbon per year. Small compared to the other 2 practices. Yes.
So when you say 5% of cropland, do you mean that's the actual amount in windbreaks, or do you mean that 5% of cropland actually has windbreaks, so it's a percentage of that?
No, no, no. This is assuming that if we have 5%, and I don't know actually, Rich, you may know exactly how, do you know what is the percentage of cropland in windbreak? It may not be 5%.
So what I hear you saying, one, the answer is no, we don't, which is an issue. What I hear you saying is that if there were 10 million acres of cropland and field windbreaks are planted, we usually say that you don't have to plant more than 5% of the acres to windbreaks to have full protection. So 5% of 10 million, that's how many acres of windbreaks?
This is assuming that this is the total. Let's say in the US we have 180 million hectares of cropland. That's how much we have. And not all that needs protection, as we know. Only a subset of, only a small fraction of that farmland needs protection. So we are assuming that is about 5%. How accurate is that? I don't know. That's why I was asking whether we have, I couldn't find statistics like that, but I'm sure that exists, that we need so many million acres that needs to be protected. But we assume that we could go up to 5%, and that is the like only that land, the linear footage, that land. Okay, so based on all these numbers, that's how much, almost 9 teragrams of carbon that could be fixed using windbreaks as an agroforestry practice. Riparian buffer, another one with a lot of potential. Again, we assumed here, let's say if a 30-meter wide riparian buffer is established along both sides of 5% of the total river length in the US, okay, 5%, that would be like 1.69 million hectares. Okay, and with that rate that we calculated based on existing data, that is about 5 teragrams of carbon per year. Okay, now what does it really mean? When you add all of this up, this is the number. You can see about 600 teragrams of carbon per year can be fixed using agroforestry. Okay, and where does that stand compared to some of the existing numbers from forested land in the US, cropland in the US? Let's look at that. See this yellow one here? That is the managed forest in one estimate. You will see that that's about the same as what we found for agroforestry, about 550. Okay? Let's look at cropland. That is the cropland, the green. Well, about 200. Substantially lower than what agroforestry could do. Here is another estimate, and these numbers, published a year later, are much smaller compared to these estimates. So if you look at that, managed forest only about 100, croplands about the same, and pasture about 50. But here is one estimate for pasture. Look at that number, 750. So why the discrepancy? I don't know. Different studies have different numbers. Some of them are not even close, as you can see here. So which one can you believe? I don't know.
Which one do you believe?
Well, can we believe our own numbers? I don't know.
that high bar pasture or is that total of
That
the
is-
two bars added together from the left?
That's the total.
Oh, that is the total, I apologize, that is the total. That, again, that is, here is the total. This is the pasture, okay? I'm sorry, this is the total, this is the total, that is the pasture. But look at again, just these two bars, managed cropland in two different studies. And here is another estimate for cropland, which is closer to the first one that I showed you here. So what is real? These are all estimates. They guesstimate, in most cases, the land base, and the rates are often taken from the literature like we did. But the land base, it's all a guesstimate. But for croplands, there are actual numbers available. Forest lands, there are actual numbers available, but still you see a lot of discrepancies based on how they calculate the rate, it looks like. So we excluded that almost 54 million hectares of grazed forest land from our number, and then you get a smaller number, about 200. So you can take it any way you want. If you include the grazed forest land, it's much better, but this is at least a beginning. Now people can go from here and start refining our numbers and come up with more accurate estimates. But we thought we needed to do something because we never had a countrywide estimate for the potential for agroforestry to sequester carbon. And IPCC and others are looking for data. We thought at least we could come up with something to set the stage. So that's what we have done. Anyway, if you look at these numbers, especially this big number here, that is, remember I told earlier, 1,600 million metric tons of carbon dioxide that we pump into the air as a country. If you look at 600, that's like 34% of our emissions. We can offset up to 34% of our carbon emissions by using agroforestry. And that is substantial. But if you use this number, that's only 13. But even then, we have a range, 13 to 34% of the US carbon emissions could be offset by agroforestry. So the good thing about that analysis was that now we can say something like this based on some data. Earlier we could say agroforestry can fix carbon, but like the cropping systems, like pasture, cropland, managed forests, we didn't have anything to compare agroforestry. Now we can compare agroforestry with these numbers and say, okay, this much at least the potential. Water quality. We talked about this yesterday quite a bit, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it. I will just simply go through the slides and reiterate that agroforestry can improve water quality. It's not just riparian buffers, keep that in mind. Even in an alley cropping, and I showed some data for the safety net role of tree roots, they could take up and clean up the groundwater, reduce the surface runoff. All these benefits can be derived from any one of our agroforestry practices. It doesn't have to be necessarily the riparian buffer or the upland buffer. Even silvopasture can do similar things. Okay, keep that in mind. And here is something that I don't think we talked about yesterday. Agroforestry can also reduce veterinary antibiotics. So if you are talking about silvopasture, and if you apply antibiotics to animals, well, you may have seen some of these statistics before, and we have a veterinarian sitting there, Charlotte. So 11 to 16 million kilograms of veterinary antibiotics applied or used annually in the US in the cattle industry. 30 to 80% of the applied antibiotics comes through the other end of the animal, and it is deposited on the pasture. Well, eventually it will end up in our drinking water, well, in water bodies, and most likely in our drinking water. So it is a major water quality concern nationally. Can agroforestry help? Well, it looks like agroforestry can help. And based on research done here, we've seen that in agroforestry soils, and that's what you see here, the yellow is soil under grasses. This bar here, this color here, is soils from agroforestry, like silvopasture, where you have trees and grasses mixed together. Comparing these two practices with just corn soybean rotation, and that's what you see here. If you look at the antibiotics that are absorbed into the soil without releasing it into the water, you can see it's much higher for soils under grasses and much higher again compared to the cropping system under silvopasture. So grasses can do the trick. They also hold on to, well, soils developed under prairie or under silvopasture or under pasture can do the same thing. They can hold on to the antibiotics longer. That's what these graphs show. And from multiple soils, 3 different soils, we are seeing consistently similar results. Okay? But that doesn't really solve the problem. If you have certain tree species like poplar, for example, look at this particular graph here. If you look at how much of that antibiotics is degraded, well, they are held in the soil, but they have to be somehow degraded, disintegrated into other compounds. If you look at the control soil, that is from a typical corn soybean rotation, and if you look at soil grown under trees, poplar, in this example, you will see that the antibiotics are disintegrated much faster. And this example, earlier I forgot to mention, we had 3 different antibiotics that we tried: oxytetracycline, sulfadimethoxin, and sulfamethazine. And this is just for the sulfamethazine that I'm showing here. You can see that the degradation is much faster, much quicker compared to the control soil. So while that is held in the soil, it's also decomposed. Microbes use as their food source, and they convert them into other compounds easily, faster, under trees. Why is it happening so? Well, here is the trick. The microbial communities associated with the root systems of trees, in this case poplar, are much better in decomposing the antibiotics and converting them to other compounds than the microbial communities that you would normally see under certain pasture grasses. So increased enzymatic activity of those microbes under the tree roots, they do the trick. Well, we have similar research showing that one grass, in particular eastern gamma grass, and the microbial communities associated with eastern gamma can do similar things. So certain species and the microbial communities associated with those root systems can do a better job in detoxifying some of these chemicals in the soil. And if we have those species in these systems, particularly in a silvopastoral system, you wouldn't get a lot of those antibiotics in your water bodies. So we can clean up the water. And the same story for herbicides. Atrazine, glyphosate, here is the control. This is with tall fescue, and this is with switchgrass, and at different distances from the source. So this bar is always high, and the red is the sediment bound, and the blue is the dissolved. So look at these 1, 2, 3 bars and compare with these 3 and these 3. This is with switchgrass. When you have that grass component, it filters the herbicides much better compared to tall fescue. So that is the bottom line. Look at this in particular here. Both sediment bound as well as dissolved is much lower in both cases. Agroforestry for air quality. I think you heard enough about water quality. What about air quality? After Rich's demonstration yesterday, I don't think I can top that, but still I'm going to show not an animation, but a modeling exercise of one of the benefits. The same windbreaks, when they apply in animal production systems, they have used a different name for it. It's called VEB, Vegetative Environmental Buffers. And we had a project, we haven't continued that in the last couple of years, but we collected data from this particular project for about 5-6 years. Dusty was involved in it, Jean Garrett was involved in it, Chung Ho Lin was involved in it. What we did was we planted a windbreak around a CAFO, confined animal feeding operation, and we measured odor, so the air quality at different distances, and used a model to figure out what's happening with and without VEB. What would happen to odor or odor particles? So these are some of the pictures and the sampling scheme from different distances from the operation here, and these were the gadgets they used to measure about $100,000 worth of equipment hauled to the site for field measurements very frequently. So a lot of data collected from this particular trial, and a lot of samples collected and analyzed using GC in the lab also. But this is what we found in the end. So that's a modeling exercise, and I'm not a modeler, and I cannot really explain all the parameters that went into creating this visual representation here, but I can clearly see what's going on with and without VEB. This is without the VEB, this is with the VEB, and this is ammonia, just one odor-causing gas, ammonia, and its distribution with and without. Tell me, what do you see? I can see the same, I'm sure you can see the same, without anybody really explaining to you. What do you see with and without VEB? This is without the VEB. This is with the VEB. Any difference that you see in the distribution of ammonia?
Looks like about a 27% reduction.
Very good. You're really good. Excellent observation. What else do you see?
The distance with which downwind.
Yeah, so if you look at the lateral distribution, the horizontal dissipation of the gases, it's, well, thanks Mike for,
I'm old, I still can't see it, I don't know.
see from, well I can point out, it goes from here to here, okay? And from, you can see distribution going all the way here too. So these lines, if you measure them, are much longer than what you see here. And you can see with the VEB has the tendency to go upward.
So where is the VEB located on that?
Well, it's not clear, but I have to assume based on what I see here, somewhere like, I don't think, it's like right here and it stopped right there. No, I don't think that is the case. You saw that from the demonstration.
Probably wherever those hot spots are.
Yeah, probably, somewhere like, you can see the hot spots maybe somewhere from here. You can see it's a lower concentration. So most likely somewhere like this, and that is pretty much the same here too. So it is the.
So the material on the right is probably adjacent to the VEB.
Before the
I mean, I'm
VEB.
sorry, adjacent to the tunnels coming out of the
Source.
house.
Yeah. Where you can see the.
So that's
the
why
real
there's
hot spot.
cloud on both sides of the VEB because he sampled inside the VEB next to the house and also on the outside of the outside of the VEB.
Yeah, this is again, definitely this is where the facility is, right in the middle. Okay, and then it is dissipating upward, sideways, but it goes more sideways. If it goes upward, well, chances are the neighbors won't smell it as much. But if it is spread laterally like this without the VEB, of course, it's going into your neighbor's house. So it clearly shows, of course, you have the data here, 27% reduction. But more than that, I think the visual, to me, that was a very convincing visual aid, just to show that, okay, I can see it's going up versus spreading more laterally. So there is a benefit. VEBs can, well, they cannot do it all, but still they can, but it depends on the stage of growth of the VEB and the design of the VEB. If designed properly, it can probably filter a lot of the odor particles and be a good practice.
Do you remember what the scale is, maybe the vertical scale of how much upward dispersion?
I don't remember all the
Okay,
details.
I know you can't remember all
Yeah.
the data, so I was just curious on how much height we're looking at.
And unfortunately, Chang Ho is not here to ask those questions
Because
at the moment. So.
we know as you move above the ground, wind speed increases. And of course, as the wind speed increases, there's more mixing and dilution. And so, and then when maybe even if it does eventually come down, it's going to be much more
Not
diluted.
Yeah.
So the principles that he talked about yesterday, Dick, was the same. The higher, the better, the
Yeah.
better mixes.
Yeah. And like Rick said, even if it comes down after that, it's not going to be that bad. It's much lower in concentration at that point. Yes.
In answer to the question earlier, on most of the livestock facilities, that barrier is set within probably 20 to 100 feet out from the building. With those, you're fairly close to, so you pick that fan, the air coming out of the building, you get it up immediately.
Well, Dusty, we have had that discussion quite a bit, like how about if you have like, well, the trees are that far, but how about if you have some grasses right where the fan hits, to really put that down before even it hits the trees.
I
Well,
worked with a large company up in North Missouri on some design modifications that they were doing to the VEBs. And one of those was to plant native tall grasses and actually put all the shade cloth attached to the house and coming down to force the air out of the fan down into the vegetation and to the ground. And you could look at one side of the grasses was a real light tan from all the dust that collected. The other side of the grass was green. And then they put their trees outside of that, which were red cedars, what they were using. But so there's a lot of ways you can toy with the design, but the grass also flexes then too, because a solid barrier creates back pressure, burns out fans and other things.
That's what I was going to ask you, if the engineers were, the ventilation engineers were okay with the shroud over it, because they had some real concerns about the.
It was not a hard angle,
Okay.
because so they've worked to minimize fan burnout,
Yeah. Okay.
Well, it doesn't look like this is still a method that they prefer. They would rather use wood chips as a biofilter. So it looks like that is the preferred way of cleaning up the air. But wood chips, again, a biofilter, but this could be a better biofilter, it looks like, but it could be more expensive. And if done properly, it could result in better improvement of air quality, not just 27% reduction. But I don't think there is a lot of research going on at the moment in designing VEBs for this particular.
In a funny world, right? The engineer prefers a wood chip biofilter that performs within predictable parameters. The vegetation, if you have a drought, does a tree die? What happens to the predictability of your filtering mechanism then? However, there are other things that we can sell VEBs and vegetative buffers on, and so I'm just, like wildlife is one of them, but there are other things that we can sell a VEB on besides, but the engineers, I think, oftentimes love the predictability of a wood chip biofilter, steady degradation of the chips as the microbial population. They can,
And BEVs take some time,
Which
too.
of the engineers you're working with, but yes.
Well, that's probably true, yeah.
And you are an engineer,
I was gonna
right?
say that from the standpoint of I work with part of that group. The other piece of this that I will throw in there that this group might want to think about and weigh in on is while measured, it reduces the odor by 27%. On farm or to the neighbors, it reduces that odor by 75%.
Perception.
Out of
Visual,
sight, out of mind.
visual
Yeah.
impact.
That visual
People
barrier
smell
takes
with
care,
their-
adds about another 50% of improvement to it.
No, it's-
Well, and obviously,
They can't see it, they
yeah.
can't smell it.
yeah.
well, in a landscaped, a nice looking facility is a completely different perception than a hard to see building on a level off pad.
That's right.
It's
So I
different.
throw that as an
Yeah,
option. of
very,
something that-
very good point. You
But
bet.
your point is well made, that at this point, most of those filters have been looked at purely from the engineering perspective of a little bit of airflow. And looking at the agroforestry piece has not been included in that, and is a real opportunity for it.
Yeah, there is potential, definitely.
I mean, there's also the time, I assume a huge thing is also the time thing. I mean, even switchgrass to get it to establish, you're talking about a couple of years as
Yeah.
opposed
Yeah.
to laying down wood chips, which you can do.
Yep.
And for trees, even longer.
Right.
And that's true, so where you have problems, most often it's an existing building, not a new one being put in. I mean, they do have problems with new ones being put in too. But in a building that's new and being constructed, you can build in landscapes around that. The buildings that are already there and have people, neighbors moving close by,
Or living-
then they need an immediate fix for that odor. And you're right, plant material takes a while to develop. So.
Well, I need to give Dusty about 20 minutes after this, so let me try to wrap this up. Agroforestry for improving soil quality. There is a lot of discussion about soil health these days. Many of you with NRCS, you know that that's been a buzzword, soil health and cover crops. Well, agroforestry can do similar things. And we have data after data after data from work done here and at other universities to show that if you have agroforestry, it improves soil physical, chemical, and biological properties. And I have data here, but I don't have the time to really explain all of it, but you have to take my word for it. It does the job very well compared to a row cropping system. Biodiversity. We do have a lot of data from the tropics to show that agroforestry can indeed benefit biodiversity. Well, the system in itself has multiple species compared to a monoculture, either corn or soybean. So there you go. And when you have that above ground biodiversity, it adds biodiversity below ground also. So overall, and then of course you invite more birds, more insects. So overall, when you have multiple plant species, you have multiple herbivores, and that includes, or that invites multiple predators. And so above ground you have higher diversity, below ground you have higher diversity. Basic ecological principle. But it also helps in multiple ways, just other than just increasing that number of species and improving that food chain all the way through the predators. It reduces pressure on natural habitats in tropical countries, so they don't have to go and cut down trees from forests. So in a way, indirectly, it protects natural habitats when agroforestry is practiced. So an indirect way of protecting and conserving biodiversity. Well, it provides native or habitat for native plants and animals that can tolerate certain level of disturbance. And we have a lot of data, including some of the studies that I did in Bangladesh, where only less than 5% of the natural forest exists at this point. Agroforestry is the only way to conserve any sort of diversity anywhere on the landscape, both plants and animals. It conserves germplasm of sensitive species. In many countries, and even here, like you heard yesterday, you can go and harvest wild plants with potential economic value. Well, you can also grow them in agroforestry so that you don't have to harvest and deplete those populations in the wild. At least we have certain strict rules and regulations, like you had yesterday, when it comes to harvesting some of these native forest products. In many countries, that's not the case. They will deplete the population. Those plants will go into extinction. Well, agroforestry is one way to start growing them under the canopy of other trees on your farm so that you can protect the wild populations.
But that issue of planting more forest land and natural native grassland to crops isn't unique to the tropics either, because we are losing thousands upon thousands of acres of woodlands and grasslands to cropland in this country every day. And there was just a recent article that came out that was looking at calling for a need for intensification of agriculture production on the existing acres. And that's the direction that we're going to have to keep going, or we're going to be just continuing to contaminate our water and air.
And you had that slide yesterday, very convincing, that even existing linear forests, as windbreaks, they are disappearing. So, very true. Yes.
And I have a question related to that. I mean, we see biodiversity conservation as a good, but I'm asking Richard, I mean, and other people who work with windbreaks, do you ever see people saying they don't want it because it could bring in deer or damage?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and when you start talking about windbreaks next to native grasslands or in pasture lands, then you're fragmenting the landscape. So there, windbreaks benefit species that are edge species, not grassland obligate or forestland obligates. And then there are the issues of attractive nuisance. Yeah.
Well, kind of a related topic here, agroforestry providing corridors. And when you see those windbreaks or riparian buffers as corridors, well, they connect major fragments of other habitats like forested, or woodlots together. So you become, or you get a much larger effective habitat size, which could be a good thing for certain species. So that's happening here. That's happening everywhere in the world. Agroforestry is helping to provide those connectors or corridors for species that are dependent on large habitat size, and that's no longer available as one contiguous habitat like that anymore. Well, it also provides other ecosystem services such as erosion control, water quality improvement, like if you have the riparian buffer. In one way, as you saw yesterday, it improves the water quality. What happens when you improve the water quality? It is protecting that habitat. So it is an indirect benefit of having that healthy riparian zone. So you improve diversity indirectly by improving that habitat. So multiple ways by which agroforestry can conserve biodiversity on the landscape. And I'm not including all the data. We have a lot of data to support all those claims on biodiversity, but I'm not including any of it today. Well, I just throw in again what Secretary Vilsack said, that we should support agroforestry as a land management approach because it helps landowners achieve certain natural resource goals such as clean water and productive soils, which will lead to economic and environmental prosperity of our nation. Well, I added that. He didn't say it's like that. But much work still remains. I'm sure all of you agree that we still need to do a lot of work. And one of them is about quantifying the ecosystem services. We do have some data, but we still need a lot more data to really drive that message home and convince our landowners at larger scales other than some of these small plot-based experiments. But also, we need to be able to quantify the economic values of these ecosystem services. So somehow we can pay the landowners. Well, we don't call it payment for ecosystem services, but in a way, we have incentive programs, and that's what we are doing. As a society, we are paying to buy that habitat or keep that habitat, as habitat, or improve the water quality. But in some countries like Costa Rica, you have something called payment for ecosystem services. Perhaps one day, we will also be making direct payments for some of these ecosystem services that we take for granted. But I hope I was able to convince you at least some of the benefits of agroforestry in terms of its ecosystem benefits. So now Dusty will talk about, in more detail I hope, the wildlife benefits of agroforestry.